Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I think we will start now. One of our speakers may not have video, but he certainly will have audio. So let me welcome you to the second of these webinars that's been hosted through our summer school at the University of Cape Town, looking at COVID-19 in different contexts, current realities and future opportunities. This, as I said, is the second in a four-part series. The first looked at the impact of COVID-19 on the economy. We had as panelists Iraj Abadian and Alan Hirsch. And it was a very stimulating conversation, and I think gave quite good insights into the impact that the pandemic is having on the economy globally, and also particularly South Africa, but also the opportunities that it presented and the responses that would be required as we come out of this this pandemic. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Herman Wasserman and Dr. Cameron Peter. They both media practitioners, theorists, who've been studying the way in which the media has been covering the pandemic, and they're going to be tackling this very prickly question of ethical reporting in times of crisis. Cameron is part of the University of Cape Town, where he's based in the Alan Gray Center for Values-Based Leadership. That's at our Graduate School of Business, GSB. And although Cameron is going to be engaging with Herman on issues around ethical reporting, Cameron actually has a degree in theoretical physics and astrophysics, so it obviously qualifies him eminently to delve into the intricacies of conspiracy theories. I'm sure there is a explanation that is also scientific. So Cameron is very interested in issues around leadership and complexity, and works across multiple disciplines, working with many leaders, decision makers, planners, stakeholders, within South Africa and the Pan-African context. And as I said, Cameron will be in conversation with Herman. Professor Wasserman is a professor at the University of Cape Town in our Faculty of Humanities, where he is in the Media Studies unit, and he is the director of the Center for Film and Media Studies at UCT, widely published and widely read. Most recent book of his is on media, geopolitics and power, looking at this from the global south, and actually won the prize named as Book of the Year by the International Communication Association's Global Communication and Social Division. He's also an editor of a journal on African journalism studies. So we really have this set up quite nicely. And the format that this is going to take is Cameron will engage in some questions and answers and conversation with Herman, probably 20 minutes or so. And we'll open up to a live question and answer. I see some of your questions already coming through on the question and answer feature on this platform that we're using. Please continue to use it. We are collating those questions, and I'll certainly use the opportunity to put your questions to Cameron and to Herman once they've had an opportunity to discuss this topic. And let me again thank Standard Bank. Standard Bank is one of the key sponsor of this webinar series of summer school. So we're really indebted to Standard Bank and thank them for their initiative and positive responses to our request for support. So without any much more ado, I'm going to hand over to Cameron. I hope that your technical issues may have been sorted out. If we can't see you, I'm sure we will be able to hear you. So I'll hand over to Cameron and to Herman.
Thank you, Russell. It's a pity my camera isn't working because I shaved my head and I had a good shave for this particular session. I'm a bit disappointed that I can't make an appearance.
So we have to be satisfied with your talking voice then, right?
Apparently I have a good radio voice. So I've been fascinated by some of the papers that Herman's been, that he sent me, that is published, and without going into too much details, about the academic work, I thought I'd field a set of general questions that related to the particular moment we're in. And although he's seen the questions beforehand, I've modified them slightly, so we still have a bit of spontaneity in the Q&A. So the first question I have for you, Herman, is a more general question, but it relates to this moment, is how have the global media impacted the quality and journalism that we're exposed to in the 21st century? So in particular, how has the media been in some ways compromised by its business model and its proximity to power? And what is influencing journalist ethics in the era of new media?
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for this opportunity. Thanks, Cameron, for that question. Yes, I think it's a good question to start with, because if we understand ethics and we understand ethics as something that's situated, these decisions that journalists have to make are always made against the background of political, social, economic, and other cultural questions and contexts. And so it's important, I think, to understand the media's current position globally. I think one of the first things to note is that journalism at the moment is under severe pressure internationally. That pressure, firstly, is political. We have seen the last few years have been some of the most dangerous for journalists. I think 2018 was noted by the Committee to Protect Journalists as the deadliest year on record for journalists around the world. So we constantly see attacks, imprisonments, disappearances of journalists also on this continent. We've seen the rise of populism, a rise of attacks on the press, also not always physical attacks, but there's a hostile climate, a climate of distrust. Much of this has been led by the American president, Donald Trump, who has created really an atmosphere of hostility around the media. So I think that's the one dimension, and I don't think South African journalists have been completely exempt from this, and I think we'll touch on some of this later on. But we've seen in recent years also attacks on journalists here, trolling online, etc. So there's a hostile climate for journalism at the moment. Economically, also journalism, I think, especially the print media at the moment, is under severe pressure. And that pressure has been mounting over the last number of years. But the COVID-19 pandemic has really exacerbated these economic conditions. We've already seen many newspapers and magazines around the world having had to close their doors. In South Africa, we've seen the Associated Magazines, and other magazines folding in recent weeks. We've had reports from especially smaller media, community media, independent media, really worried about their the ability to continue to exist. So there's severe economic pressure on journalism as well. although we've seen, I think, excellent investigative journalism over the last few years in this country, we're thinking about the state capture saga and the role that journalism has played there. Such journalism is expensive, and it's often very difficult to support that. That journalism increasingly is also dependent on donor funding, which brings with its own set of problems or complexities. So those are the two sort of, I think, main pressures that we're seeing. And if we're looking at again, another dimension of this broader context, and especially the context within which disinformation is rising, and that is the rise of digital platforms.
Sorry, Herman. Sorry, Herman. Can you? Sorry, Herman. If you could just repeat that, because you faded out for a bit. Okay. So I think, yeah.
Repeat from where? Okay, I'll just repeat from to say that there have been the two main pressures, I think, have been political and economic in nature. Can you hear me? Is it clear?
Yeah, now it's clear.
Okay, and I think the third factor that I would like to highlight in terms of the contextual factors that are impacting on especially the rise of disinformation, where we might be heading in the conversation later on, is the rise of digital platforms. So especially in the last few years, social media has really made it possible for anybody with an internet connection to contribute to this mediated public sphere, to the creation of media. So people are no longer passive audiences. One could debate whether they've ever been really passive audiences, but increasingly they contribute to the sharing, the posting, the creation of media. And although that has democratized media to a large extent, it has also created a glut of information. There's so much noise out there that it's sometimes difficult to verify. It doesn't know, it's hard to know what is true and what is not, hard to establish the veracity and the provenance of information. Where does it come from? So there's really a lot of information out there. So this is the broader background, I think, within which we have to think about media ethics at the moment, and also the rise of things like misinformation and disinformation.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me because, quite clearly there's so much optimism around the potential for, citizen journalism, through the advent of the internet and social media. But at the same time, those very industries are based on models which, drive a business model where things appear free, but they're actually advertising driven, and they're driven by, being able to collect information about people that's there.
Yes, I think that is
and that brings to the industry of journalism in that sense.
Yes, I think the business models of the past have been upended completely. I think that the traditional business model of journalism has been one that's highly reliant on advertising, especially print media. That business model has collapsed, especially with audiences migrating to the web, to the internet. And it's not yet clear exactly what the best business model is for journalism on the web. As you say, the increased, what one could call the datafication, is also an important factor. A large part of the business model is also dependent on creating economies of scale. In other words, creating large audiences and getting access to people's data. And this has given rise to other ethical questions, and especially if we think about artificial intelligence and the so-called data colonialism, the exploitation of people's data. And so that has given rise to a whole surveillance culture, which is also problematic in its own right.
That could be your next book, New Media in the Era of Surveillance Capitalism.
It's already good.
So moving on, we alluded to disinformation, and my next question is around that. And so the question essentially is, how has disinformation and the exertion of asymmetric power by foreign and or domestic actors influence how we respond to, for example, the key issues that affect us and should be nonpartisan, but quickly become politicized, such as the current pandemic, but also climate change, resource scarcity, and the like? And what does this say, particularly about the reflexivity between politicians and social media, which provides an alternative channel through which they can directly reach the citizenry?
Okay, that's a mouthful. I think one thing to note here is that when we talk about misinformation, we talk about a big spectrum, right? And maybe we can touch on some of the specific aspects of misinformation that has arisen around COVID-19, for instance. But I think it relates to your earlier points about the economic model and the whole clickbaiting sort of journalism. When you have a journalism environment that is so dependent on instant access, on clicks, on eyeballs, on sort of responsiveness, and when you have an erosion of the economic basis, which made more longer, slower types of journalism, like investigative journalism, possible, you create the conditions, of course, for a public sphere, a mediated public sphere that becomes highly dependent on responses, on emotive responses, on attacks, on tit for tat type of debate. And it makes it very difficult for a sort of really deeper and more engaged narrative to be developed. So, for instance, if we look at Twitter, for instance, one of the major social media platforms at the moment, a lot of what we see is people with existing ideas, ingrained biases, maybe already very established opinions, and people sort of throw those opinions back and forth at each other. In other words, that the context becomes highly polarized. And to come back to your question around how politicians and politics responds to this sort of environment, is that it has also created what is referred to as echo chambers. So it is possible for me to select who I follow on Twitter, on a social media, in other words, who I listen to and who I want to listen to me. I can filter out all opposing and dissenting views, and I can create a sort of echo chamber where the only things and only people that I hear around me are people that confirm my own biases. That creates fertile ground, of course, for populism, for populist politicians, because they can target a certain echo chamber, and you know, it can amplify their views and without fear of dissent. But it also makes it very difficult for people to get access to trustworthy information, because you don't always have access to alternative points of view. And so what happens is that sort of biases get confirmed and gets hardened, and social and political identity positions become hardened. And it becomes harder and harder for us to cross those divides. And in a country like South Africa, which is a highly unequal country that is still marred by the context of colonialism and apartheid, the geography of apartheid is around us, but also the sort of the social and cultural identities of apartheid is still largely ingrained in our society. The combination of these factors, I think, makes a sort of really informed and really a sort of sensitive and contextually sensitive political debate very difficult. And this brings me back to your earlier points about the alignment of journalism with power. And I think this creates an ethical problem for journalism, because it raises the ethical imperative really on journalists to also cross those divides, to really make an effort to find ways across these echo chambers, across these divides that are still also determined by history and our context.
You know, the internet and the social media in particular has changed, you know, whether it be marketing or electioneering, is that whereas previously people would be targeted in broad demographic bands, you know, white males between the age of 25 and 35, for example, now because of the kind of precise information we are able to collect on individuals and small groups, we are able to have much more targeted propagandistic messaging, essentially, that really push people's pressure points, their biases, their fears, their worries, and it's fascinating because it's the creation of the echo chambers and polarization has been quite a recent thing. The same people who voted for Obama ended up voting for Trump. And, Trump was helped by, Cambridge Analytica, by all accounts, who were doing background research of where and who to target. And it's very interesting because it seems like to me, in an anecdotal way, that his mixed messaging across America during the 2016 election might have reflected more of what they understood about the data rather than any kind of express real convictions or beliefs he had as a politician. And he's famous for using the word fake news, kind of ironically. So my next question is really, what is fake news? I know in my readings of your paper, you really go into it in quite some detail. So for the audience's sake, I'd like to ask, how is it defined, and what are the different ideas around it?
Yes, I think the term fake news has become is obviously bandied about a lot. I think there's a growing consensus among scholars, at least, that we should try and avoid that term for the very reason which you've mentioned, and that is the weaponization of the term fake news by politicians such as Trump. So one of the easiest ways to refute that is to say that, if something is fake, it cannot be news. News has to be verified. And if something is, it's a contradiction in terms, in other words. But it also allows, the term fake news allows politicians to undermine not only specific and individual journalistic platforms and journalists, but allows for an erosion really of the whole environment of trust in not only journalism, but also in truth itself. So whether there's also the notion of that we live in a post-truth society, or that we've now live in a society where it's where there's a widespread doubt in systems, in politics, in really the whole environment, the whole political, economic, social complex. So fake news, there's growing consensus, as I've said, that we should rather opt for terms like misinformation and disinformation and malinformation. UNESCO makes that distinction between, say, misinformation as something that is false, untrue, and cannot be verified, and disinformation is something that is intentionally false. In other words, something that is seeking to mislead people. I think it's a more nuanced way of looking at it. But even misinformation and disinformation spans a big spectrum. I mean, it ranges from the sort of things that you get on WhatsApp, your uncle with a PhD from WhatsApp University that sends you a bit of information on WhatsApp about COVID-19 and 5G, etc. That sort of pieces of misinformation. It spans to large orchestrated campaigns like the Bell Pottinger campaign that we've seen in South Africa, where there's an intense and a long campaign trying to mislead and trying to sow a contrary narrative. So it does span quite a number of different types of information and types of expression. But I think the distinction between misinformation and disinformation is more useful than fake news.
Yeah, it speaks to the need for us to become intelligent consumers of media and whatever news we receive in particular, because essentially, it's easy to manipulate even truthful information based on the understanding of what fears and biases people may be, to really send a different message than what the facts might dictate. So what I'm saying is that sometimes it's a mixture of fact and fiction that's spun out there in such a way to create, for the effect that's politically expedient for some. So the other thing I've been noticing is as the COVID-19 crisis has unfolded, is how information uncertainty, similarly to what transpired during the advent of the HIV pandemic, when little was understood about it, actually led to a lot of confusion about what to do about it, which ultimately cost many, many lives. And it strikes me that we are in a similar moment. Because of this information uncertainty, we're not quite sure exactly what kind of phenomenon we're dealing with. At first we were told, it isn't dangerous to children, and now we're finding out differently. First we were told that it's only the elderly who are, that it's a mild flu, and we're finding out new things about this disease all the time. It may end up being something like HIV/AIDS, like a syndrome rather than a disease. So it makes it particularly difficult, not just for the public, but also journalists themselves to be able to report on this. So, you alluded to Bell Pottinger, and, I thought we should explore that a bit more, because the reason I'm sitting here is I worked on the academic draft report on state capture. And while working on it, we observed, Pottinger's campaign and what it did in 6 to 8 months. It created irreversible changes in the political discourse that existed in South Africa. It popularized radical economic transformation. It put the term white monopoly capital on people's lips. And, even terms like land expropriation without compensation became popularized through that. So I suppose, I would like to explore a bit more about how these kinds of disinformation campaigns have impacted us in the South African context. And what have tell us about some of the findings of your studies?
Well, the findings in recent years, my studies around misinformation have concentrated on motivations. So let me backtrack a little bit to say that I think what we have to remember is that, facts are things that you can verify, but facts become truth within a social and cultural, economic, historical context. In other words, truth is socially, politically, historically constructed. Okay, so in other words, if we want to try and understand why something like Bell Pottinger or even some of the COVID-19 misinformation has become successful, we have to try and understand what this speaks to, what this resonates with. What are the fears and the anxieties? What are the anger, the outrage? What's alive in people's minds? So merely to counter something with facts is not always enough. We have to try and understand what motivates people to believe this, what motivates people to mistrust maybe other forms of information. And so if we want to look at Bell Pottinger, for instance, the notion of white monopoly capital and radical economic transformation was successful and it landed in fertile ground because of the incomplete project of transition in the country, incomplete transformation because of the high economic inequalities that we still see around us. It becomes easier for people to sometimes believe in conspiracy theories, believe in alternative explanations, or the alternative truths, I think the White House called it, alternative facts. Easier to believe in alternative narratives if the dominant narrative doesn't make sense to you. The dominant narrative doesn't resonate with your everyday lived experience. So if the dominant narrative of a new democratic South Africa doesn't resonate with your everyday life, which hasn't changed much since 1994, then something like an orchestrated campaign like Bell Pottinger can work. So my point with all of this is that there's a lot of the response to misinformation has been on the level of media literacy and fact-checking and so on, and that's very important. I think that we see fact-checking organizations like Africa Check and others doing really important work to point out inaccuracies and untruths. But unless we also understand what the social and cultural and political context is within which people consume this information, I don't think that alone will be enough. So much of my research in the last few years have focused on the motivations for consuming and sharing misinformation. And that's a very interesting area, and there are many different types of explanations that we can maybe later discuss later on. But all of them have to do with where people find themselves, where they are situated, and reasons for mistrusting maybe the mainstream news narrative or the mainstream political narratives. And I think this is why Bell-Pottinger had that impact on the landscape, is because it really tapped into, and cleverly so, tapped into a widespread, I think, malaise, a widespread unhappiness with transformation in the country.
If I could just come in at this point, there's some sort of questions coming through, and I want us to, in the half hour or so that we have left, I want to try and steer us a little more towards understanding how COVID is being dealt with in media, and I don't restrict it just to mainstream media, speaking also about social media, and I think that the way you and Herman and Cameron, you sort of set it up quite nicely, the broader socio-economic political context, but one of the issues that people are obviously preoccupied with is the way in which conspiracy theories emerge and become popular, gain sort of popularity, and it obviously seems to be the case that these conspiracy theories proliferate a lot faster during periods of crises, right? So with COVID, we see all these conspiracy theories that are beginning to pop up. And it's almost as if there's a tension between science or health on the one hand and popular misbelief or disbelief. So where do these conspiracy theories, where do they fall in this idea of misinformation or disinformation, or is this a category all of its own? And is it something that we need to be more mindful during periods of crisis, or is it something that we've always just had to deal with and live with? So to you, Herman, first.
Okay, I think there's a long answer, but I'll try a shorter answer. I think the short answer here is that the prevailing emotions at the moment in time of a pandemic are anxiety, fear, uncertainty. We're dealing with a phenomenon that even scientists are still trying to figure out exactly how it works. So in a context where these are the prevailing emotions and the prevailing views, it's much easier for something like conspiracy theories as alternative explanations to take root. And I think conspiracy theory certainly falls on that spectrum of misinformation, and it can be sometimes exploited, and it becomes disinformation when it's deliberately exploited to mislead people. But sometimes it's just part of that noise, part of that information out there that is hard to verify. And here I think people are increasingly wanting to look at established media outlets and sources of authority for verification, and trying to be sort of guiding points, lodestars in this very confusing time. And unfortunately, part of the whole climate of post-truth and misinformation, etc., has undermined the authority of not only mainstream media, but also sometimes authority in itself, any authority, whether that's political authority or scientific authority, and so sometimes it becomes a question that people just find it hard to believe anything, and I think this is the climate that has been created in the last number of years, where there's a sort of really erosion of trust in systems, whether these are scientific, political, economic, or media systems.
You know, during a period of crisis, it's very important for ordinary citizens to be able to trust their government. Because not only are they the elected officials, but of course, they're the main source of information during a crisis. And in this pandemic, globally, that's been the case. But that it's governments that have actually been the main sources of information, and our country is no different. Now, have governments, to some extent, been their own worst enemies, in that if this issue, the COVID issue, as we've mentioned, is really about science and health, okay? And unfortunately, in many countries, it's become politicized. Some will say, in some contexts, even weaponized. But it is fundamentally about health and science. So, do governments become their worst enemies then when they monopolize the information, the media, and not allow those who have the knowledge, the scientists, the health practitioners, to be out there? And even if they are going to be debating and disagreeing, that there's more credibility. Or at least where people can feel that there's no political agenda necessarily at play here. So just to use the most recent example of the head of the Medical Research Council having who comes with a scientific and background, expressing a view in relation to government guidelines on COVID, and yet the response of government is to try to silence, to stifle this sort of debate. And doesn't that then create this sort of fertile ground for conspiracy theories that we see proliferate?
Cameron, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, I mean, just to say, we're in a particular political moment way before COVID happened. And in this political moment, what we've seen is a real skepticism of establishment institutions. And I know there was a study sort of reported in the Harvard Business Review, which looked at all the institutions, government, the media, as well as academics and so-called, experts and expert opinion. And there was, as well as the private sector, and public confidence in all of these institutions was at an all-time low. So there's been we're in a moment where politically there's great skepticism about the establishment. So it's no wonder that whatever a government does, you will find some kinds of grounds to criticize them. And I think, Fareed Zakaria wrote a very interesting article where he was saying, this crisis is too important to leave to the scientists alone, because we're a society and decisions that get made by governments are political, whether we like it or not. And I think what it speaks to is a need for a more kind of open, inclusive governance of, not just an expert-run one, but one that really speaks to the different sectors of society and includes them in the decision-making and brings a broad set of interdisciplinary experts, as some of the scientists have recently, written a letter requiring of government. They wrote it under the Academy of Science South Africa, saying that we need a broader set of disciplinary insights into this. We need sociologists, we need anthropologists, we need, alongside healthcare experts, for example, to inform how we make intelligent decisions. And I think good governance in this moment and strong leadership is best exemplified by the kind of leadership that the New York State Governor, Andrew Cuomo, has shown. It's been remarkable how every day he's had a full 2-hour press session where he briefs the public on exactly what is happening and why.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I think if I can come in here, I think this is part of the problem in our country in the recent weeks. What we've seen, I think, is there are various dimensions to it. But I think, firstly, I think our government hasn't been very good in communicating the motivations and rationales for their decisions. So this is, for instance, the smoking ban. For a long time, until I think the last address by the president, where he sort of explicitly mentioned some of the motivation for the health aspects around smoking, there hasn't been a good explanation for this, or at least it wasn't communicated properly. And that led to all sorts of conspiracy theories, agendas, etc., being attributed to Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma and cigarette smuggling, etc. If there's no clear transparency, and when it comes to, Cameron, your point about governance, I mean, if there's no good communication and transparency, then you create that environment where people will start speculating and conspiracy theories will start circulating. I think part of this also has to do with the media's role and the way that the media has understood their role since democracy in this country. And that has been the dominant version, the dominant notion of what media's role in the democracy should be is that of a watchdog, right? So keeping government accountable. And that's a very important role. But sometimes I fear that it's also confused with contrarianism, in the sense that nothing that government does is ever good or correct. Sometimes I feel that journalists are so scared that they will be seen as being in cahoots with government or being collaborators that they, that everything the government does is attacked. So when you have this combination of a sort of contrarian environment created by the media, and you have a government that is poor in communicating, then you have the conditions that are rife, I think, for all sorts of alternative explanations and conspiracy theories and things to circulate. I think what is also important, maybe just the last point, and also to touch on your question of, I think you mentioned where the sources of authority for knowledge comes from. It is really important. I think this, maybe just to touch on this, the Glenda Gray issue as well. I think it is, of course, very worrying that that government has sought to silence her and that there's been sort of this clampdown. But I think the issue is also that the media tend to listen to elite sources and often do not adequately really respond to people's everyday worries and concerns and anxieties. They don't often listen to them. There was a report yesterday that came out. The Media Monitoring Africa brought out a report indicating who the main sources of media reports have been in the last number of weeks. And these are dominated by politicians. And they're also dominated by male voices. So you have a lack of diversity, really, and very few, and I should add, the most important finding there was that very few reports actually spoke to ordinary people and tried to find out what ordinary people think, what their fears are, what their, there's a lot of inferring or people trying to speak on behalf of the poor instead of actually going to listen to them. And this is a trend that has been ongoing, and some of my other research has been around activism and community protests. We've seen community protests and police brutality to be, in the community protests for many years in this country, the last 10 years at least. Now it is surfacing maybe more so because the elites and the middle classes are also feeling uncomfortable and feeling inconvenienced, and and some of that attention is turning to them. But this is not a new thing. Police dishing out violence disproportionately to poor people. And so I think when you also have that added dimension of a media that doesn't always listen enough to the experiences of ordinary people, then you have that dislocation. You have that gap opening up between people's everyday experiences and the voices and the sources and the claims to authority that they hear in the media. And again, that feeds into the likelihood of people believing misinformation.
That's a nice sort of way into the questions around social media and social media platforms, because we know in South Africa that we have a history of monopoly when it comes to our media, right? Big companies, big corporations, conglomerates that have dominated and therefore have been in a position to control what is considered news or information. One of you mentioned earlier the way in which social media has democratized information, the phenomenon of citizen journalists. During this period of crisis, this COVID crisis, what's your sense of the role that social media has played? Has it been a constructive and informative, holding government's feet to the fire, as it were? Or has it been more around the proliferation of conspiracy theories, misinformation, disinformation? Or is the jury still out? How has social media acquitted itself during this COVID crisis?
I think one would have to do a sort of systematic analysis and see what the sort of dominant themes were that were emerging. But I think what I've just anecdotally picked up, I think, in the last weeks or so, is that there's been a clear shift towards, I think, polarizations. People, and that was largely along the split of whether the economy should open or not, whether we should trust government in terms of the lockdown measures or not. There's less and less listening and less sort of entertainment of other people's views and points of view, and sort of a confirmation of people's existing fears and biases, etc. I think social media can be a very important platform for people to mobilize and for questions to be raised, etc. But it can also, of course, be a place where you can descend very easily into a sort of name calling and trolling and attacks.
Russell, if I can make a short stab here,
yes, Cameron, yeah.
I'm sort of run a non-profit organization called the Center for Analytics and Behavioral Change, which has been covering, online sort of social media and online kind of media narratives that are emerging around the COVID-19 crisis. And it was very interesting because at first there was actually quite a lot of support for government. And there was very little fake news on social media platforms and on the internet because government made it illegal, although these were still circulating on WhatsApp. So, protected platforms. And there was a lot of support for government at first, but as the crisis started to, wear on and people started losing jobs and were, unable to leave their homes, it's quite interesting because what really shows up is that there are two lockdown realities which mirror the kind of deep inequality we have in our society. And so, a different set of resentments accrued around the middle classes and the wealthier than from the poor. But both increasingly became more aggrieved with the conditions, the severity of the lockdown in particular. And as time wore on, questions around things like alcohol and smoking and the access to cigarettes, ability to buy, became more and more pronounced in the conversation. So it's really, it's also dependent on the kind of conditions we've been put into in lockdown, and the kind of crisis and the pressure cooker that people are under as manifested. But I wouldn't say by and large, because the analysis we do is not systematic, it's daily, and it looks at highest volume, highest reach, and highest impact. The themes that emerge are pretty much the kinds of themes you'd expect to emerge, and they do mirror a lot of what's transpiring in the media. The point is that the dangerous stuff don't usually show up in the kind of huge volumes, and you don't notice it because these are residuals operating on the fringes. You don't notice them until the conditions change and they come to dominate the conversation in a spectacular way, like with the 2016 election of Donald Trump, which no one saw coming. So it's more complex than just, people trashing, trash talking on social media there's a lot of intelligent conversation on it as well.
I mean, I think one of the features of conspiracy theories is the invention of bogeymen or bogey people. Let's have it as sort of gender neutral, and it may be interesting just to hear your views as to how it is that certain individuals become sort of singled out. One in particular that has surprised a lot of people is Bill Gates. Bill Gates, for example, years before COVID, had already been warning people about the potential for a virus of this global impact. And he's spending most of his fortune to find ways to deal with communicable diseases. And yet he himself has now become a target of sort of conspiracy theories. Do you have any sort of views as to how things like that develop?
Yes, I think, my view on that would be that, again, this is not about Bill Gates as an individual. I don't think it's about people that attack Bill Gates might not even exactly know what he's done in recent years, as you say, his efforts in communicable diseases, etc. Bill Gates is a symbol. He's a representative of capital, of big money, of maybe the system, the man, and I think a lot of this has to do with, again, this lack of trust in systems, in authority. And if we go back to the research around that I mentioned earlier around motivations, why people share this information, one of the main characteristics of that behavior is that people are railing against something. They want to express their anger. They feel powerless. They are under lockdown. Their businesses are faltering. Their source of income has fallen away. Here is a rich person. And he's representative of everything that they are angry about. So again, I don't think this is somebody that has gone and done research around Bill Gates and decided they don't like him. It's about a representative of a whole system. Unfortunately, I think there was this case also in South Africa where News 24 made a mistake of repeating one of those conspiracy theories, and that might have also amplified some of it. But I think largely this has to do with that system. I mean, it is also linked to the whole question of 5G. I mean, there's this conspiracy around 5G towers. And again, this is something that we don't know. It's a new technology. It's something that we can't explain. And if your life has become unpredictable, if all your old certainties seem to be falling away, then it becomes easier to grasp at these sort of explanations. Maybe just one other thing before I give Cameron a chance to say something. I think it also, what we see here is these things like 5G, Bill Gates, etc. These are easier to dismiss. It's easier to counter these sort of misinformation with facts. But and just some of the questions around that have been submitted here as well around government's sort of communication. And just to return to our question earlier, I think when there's a lack of transparency, when people feel that government isn't communicating properly, it becomes easier also on social media for people to read all sorts of things, motivations into government's decisions and actions. And I think this is where the media have also been sometimes clutching at straws because they don't know either, because government is incommunicative or they're not transparent. And then, there are these agendas around what is the real reason for the cigarette ban? Is it because there's some smuggling network and government is corrupt, etc.? I think where there's lack of transparency, where there's lack of information, the Washington Post's recently adopted slogan of democracy dies in darkness. I think that is a really apt summation of this environment. When there's darkness, when there's lack of transparency, then democracy, democratic debate is dying.
Cameron, you want to weigh in here?
You know, if I can say, you know, that my concern is not so much with conspiracies around Bill Gates or even 5G, to be honest with you. My concern is around conspiracies which, or any kind of narrative manipulation that can basically constitute a threat to social cohesion. So what kind of narratives that can be spun out there, whether they're conspiratorial or not, that divide society? And, you know, I spoke about how, you know, there's two different lockdowns happening in this, and it mirrors the inequality in our society. Then that starts, you know, provoking the conditions for a kind of split in our society to occur. And on top of that, we've got to be very mindful of where, you know, blame can be assigned locally. You know, it could easily be, you know, look at these foreigners who've come into our country and they may be bringing a disease illegally across the border. And that kind of rhetoric is what, you know, my organization and personally what concerns me the greatest, is because when we start to see this fracture and split of society, we've got to ask some serious questions about why it's occurring. And sometimes it occurs organically in a society, but what we've seen globally is there has been manipulation of these narratives by foreign powers looking to exert asymmetric power to further their own interests within sort of countries' domestic politics. And this is something that we have to be mindful of. And we need to start building the capabilities to counter effectively, because we're not going to regulate those kinds of problems away. The technology moves too fast. So it's a deeper question for me around these kind of conspiratorial narratives. You know, we can target Bill Gates. He's rich enough to escape all of us. But, you know, an ordinary person walking down the street is a completely different story in terms of their vulnerability.
We're coming towards the close, and so in sort of closing remarks from both of you, I'd like you just to maybe throw out some suggestions there as to what would be some of the more effective ways in which communication can take place to maybe counter a lot of the conspiratorial stories out there, the misinformation, disinformation, and also, do you think that this crisis will perhaps help us to improve the way in which we communicate, or or is it going to exacerbate the distrust and polarization that we are seeing presently? So we'll start with you, Herman, and then we'll conclude with Cameron.
Okay, thanks, Russell. I think I'll start by linking to what Cameron's just said about social cohesion. I'd like to flip it a little bit by saying that I share your concern that I'm not concerned about the 5G, Bill Gates, those sort of things. I think we should be more concerned about when people are advising, you know, others to inject themselves with bleach, etc., and drink remedies and concoctions. I mean, that can be really dangerous. But I think what I would argue is that this sort of misinformation doesn't necessarily create or fragment some pre-existing social cohesion. It really draws on pre-existing inequalities. I think that's what you also indicated. I mean, the two lockdowns, etc. And I think misinformation thrives and draws on people's existing anxieties and people on the social. I mean, what I've said earlier about the social constructiveness of truth. That truth is constructed within social and political histories. So I think I would divide it. You said, Russell, what should we do? I think I would say three things. I think if you're a journalist, I think you would obviously have to fact check. There was earlier a question also around whether journalists should have fact checked Brenda Gray's statements around malnutrition. And I think, you know, journalists believe that academics are authorities on their in their areas, and they don't always have to fact check it. But maybe when there's a controversial statement like this, it would rather err on the side of caution. But I think what journalists should fact check, but go beyond fact checking. I think there should be much more listening, much more attuned listening to people's experiences. And this goes to the question of our inequalities and the different experiences of the situation. There was this saying that was circulating on social media saying, we're all in the same storm, but we're not all in the same boat. Okay, we're all in the same storm, but we're not all in the same boat. And this storm is affecting people in different ways. And I think if journalism is only focusing on how this affects businesses or suburban people that can't move around, or you can't buy your alcohol and your tobacco, and don't always listen to the stories of the other, the majority of people that might experience this in a very different way. So I think that sort of listening, that sort of keen awareness and being attuned to people's experiences, I think, is important for journalists, and that will already establish more trust, I think, in journalism and in mainstream journalism. I think us citizens, media users, we also have an ethical responsibility to check whatever we receive, to always doubt the veracity, always doubt the provenance of something and check it out. Do not share information if you are not completely sure that this is accurate and truthful. If something pushes your button, if something makes you angry, if something gets you worked up, then you should ask, why is this making me so angry, and why are they succeeding? Why is this bit of message that I received, this voice note that I received on WhatsApp, why is this making me so angry? And maybe then think twice before sharing that. Thirdly, I think in terms of government, I think government really has a responsibility to be more transparent. There was also a question earlier, I think in the chat, around government not always making the statistics and their projections, their modeling available. So I think that is also an important lesson, I think, that we've learned here, or hopefully the government is also learning that lesson, that if you're not transparent, if you don't communicate properly, if you hide things or you don't explain them properly, then you really feed into these conspiracy theories, misinformation, and you will have people attribute all sorts of agendas to you that you might have avoided if you were just more clear about things from the start.
Thank you very much, Herman. Cameron, some concluding.
Yeah, I'll be very quick.
From yourself.
I'll be very quick because I think Herman's basically touched on all the key points. Especially when he spoke about attuned listening. I think it's absolutely critical in a crisis that we do have that from our journalists. I'm still romantic about the internet. I do think that it's an opportunity to build active citizenry and hopefully to get healthier public discourse going, a more informed one going, and to have some kind of active citizen journalism that puts some power in people's hands. But that said, I'm still a big fan of traditional journalism. And I think there's a previous crisis that we can look to where our media failed us miserably, and it was Marikana. Because that's precisely what they failed to do in that moment, is to do the attuned listening, to go and interview ordinary people, the wives of those miners that were up there, demonstrating. And they didn't get those stories from those communities, which could have unlocked and make us better understand why that crisis was mounting into, a potentially, eventually, ultimately a disastrous situation. So I think that even in this moment, we've got to be very careful about the narratives. The media in particular has to be very careful about where it gets its narratives from. And if its narratives are directed solely by those who are in power, and I don't just mean those who have political or wealth kind of power, but also the intelligentsia of a country. And they miss those stories of ordinary people, I think they do us a huge disservice in a moment of crisis where those are precisely the voices that need to be elevated.
Well, thank you very much to both of you. I think that the very, very insightful, and we really appreciate you sharing your insights, your knowledge, and the research that you have been doing. Thanks everyone else who listened in, and there will be a podcast of this which you can access. And I just want to thank Standard Bank for sponsoring this webinar series. There are follow-up webinars on ethical leadership as well, and other topics. So please look out for that. Summer School will be advertising that, and we hope that you'll be able to join us soon for those discussions. Thank you very much, everyone, and stay safe and take care of yourselves. Good evening.
Thank you.
you.